Okay, so let's start here. In order to understand colonial assemblies, we have to start with the Virginia House of Burgesses. So the Virginia House of Burgesses was the first elected legislative assembly in the North American colony, and it was created in July of 1619 when Governor Sir George Yeardley called for a representative assembly in the Virginia colony to assist him in governing the settlement. The House of Burgesses was actually created partly to appease the growing population of Virginia. Remember, the Virginia Company is a joint stock company that invested in the colony, but they were losing money hand over fist. They needed more people to come out there and work the land. But the settlers did not want to simply be subjects of an absolute monarch. They wanted some voice in how they were being governed. So the House of Burgess, established in 1619, was a sort of compromise. It allowed for the settlers to have a little bit of a voice in terms of making laws for the colony. Now, those laws still had to be approved by the governor, but at least the Burgesses had a say in what the laws were going to be. And that represented a significant step away from the autocratic rule of the earlier days of the colony. And that was really due to English traditions of parliamentary representation that allowed for local towns to have a voice in national affairs. Well, okay, so sorry, local colony affairs. Okay, sorry, local colony affairs. Anyway, the point is that the House of Burgesses developed along the same lines as English parliamentary representation. The representatives would be elected by the people in the localities, and then those representatives would legislate on behalf of the people. That was the theory anyway. In reality, only landowners were allowed to vote in elections for the Burgesses, which meant that only landowners were allowed to participate in the government. Now don't get me wrong, this was a big deal for the colonists because it gave them more of a voice in how they were governed, but it also meant that most of the colonists were excluded from the political process. I mean, after all, most of them were either servants or indentured laborers who didn't own any land, so they couldn't vote and therefore they couldn't participate in the government. But still, this was a step towards democracy, and it would prove to be an important one. Okay, so now let's fast forward a little bit. Let's go from the 1620s to the 1640s. Between 1620 and 1642, the Virginia House of Burgesses grew in power, and during that period, the colony grew as well. So there was more representation in the House of Burgesses, but that meant that the governor didn't necessarily have the final say on all matters. He had to negotiate with the Burgesses, and that was actually kind of a big deal because remember, up until this point, the governor was like the king's representative, and therefore he had ultimate authority. But now he had to share that authority with the Burgesses. This was especially true when it came to taxation. The Burgesses argued that since they represented the people, they should have a say in how taxes were levied. But the governor argued that because he was the king's representative, he had the authority to tax the people as he saw fit. Well, eventually the Virginia Company realized that it couldn't compete with the royal governor in terms of power, so they just gave up and granted all power to the governor. And so in 1624, King Charles I formally merged the Virginia colonies and the Virginia Company into a royal colony, and that meant that the governor now reported directly to the king and the Burgesses had even less power. But nevertheless, by 1642, the House of Burgesses had become a bicameral legislature consisting of two chambers, the upper house and the lower house. The lower house was the one that was elected by the people. The upper house consisted of appointed members of the governor's council. Now the governor's council could also propose and pass laws, but the elected Burgesses had more power. They had the power of the purse, which meant that they controlled the money, and if the governor's council proposed a law that the Burgesses didn't like, they could refuse to fund it. And so this meant that the Burgesses had a lot more power than the governor's council. And that was important because it meant that the people had a greater voice in how they were governed. Okay, so now let's move beyond Virginia. After Virginia established its system of representative government, the other colonies began to follow suit. So Massachusetts Bay, for example, established its general court in the 1620s. Now this was different from the House of Burgesses, because it was dominated by Puritan freemen who participated in the general court. And that's not like Virginia where only landowners could vote. In New England colonies, more people could participate in government, and that's because property requirements for voting were lower in New England. Also in New England, the idea of town meetings was more popular. Town meetings allowed for all adult males to participate in local government regardless of whether they owned property or not. Now this wasn't true in the southern colonies. In the southern colonies, the assemblies were more like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, where only property owners could vote and participate in government. And that's because the southern colonies were more aristocratic than New England. Landowners dominated the assemblies in the South, while in New England, more people could participate. Regardless, the point is that all the colonies had some form of representative government by the mid-18th century. Okay, so now let's fast forward again to the 1730s and 1740s. By this point, colonial assemblies had grown in power significantly. They were able to assert their dominance over royal governors, and they were able to do this largely because the governors relied on them to provide funds for them to do their jobs. Like the governor couldn't run his government without the funding provided by the colonial assembly, and so the assemblies had a lot of leverage over the governors. This was especially true during the era of salutary neglect, which was a period of time when the British government was not enforcing the regulations and laws that they had made for the colonies. So this gave the assemblies even more power because the governors had no one to answer to except the assemblies. And so the assemblies were essentially running the colonies with very little interference from the British government. Now, this didn't last forever, of course. Eventually, the British government decided that they wanted to crack down on the colonies, but for a period of about 30 years, the assemblies were in charge. During this time, the assemblies clashed with the royal governors over a variety of issues, such as taxation, legislation, and economic policies. And this was a big deal because it set the stage for the American Revolution. The assemblies argued that since they represented the people, they should have a say in how the colonies were governed. But the royal governors argued that because they were appointed by the king, they had the authority to govern the colonies as they saw fit. Of course, the colonial assemblies won this battle, but it was a close one, and it was only because of the support of the people that they were able to win. Okay, so now let's talk about the social composition of colonial assemblies. Who could vote for these assemblies? Well, as we've already mentioned, generally only property-owning white men were allowed to vote for colonial assemblies. Now this excluded a lot of people, including women, Native Americans, enslaved Africans and poor non-landowners, but nevertheless, compared to England, this was still a pretty broad franchise. In fact, in many colonies over 60% of white males could vote, and that was because the colonies needed to attract settlers in order to grow, and so they needed to offer these settlers some kind of incentive. And what better incentive is there than the right to vote? This actually contributed to a very vigorous political culture in the colonies, because so many more people could vote than could in England. But ultimately, despite the fact that more people could vote in the colonies than in England, the vast majority of people were still excluded from the political process. The colonists justified this exclusion based on the idea of stakeholder, which is basically the idea that only people who had a financial stake in the colony should be allowed to vote. But really what it amounted to was just a way of keeping most people out of the government. Okay, so now let's bring our story to a close. We've been focusing on the Virginia House of Burgesses and how it evolved over time, but let's take a step back and look at it from a broader perspective. What was the significance of the House of Burgesses and other colonial assemblies? Well, they were significant for a number of reasons. First of all, they represented a new way of governing. They were the first representative government in North America, and that was a big deal because it set the stage for the American Revolution. The colonists got used to having some say in how they were governed, and they weren't about to give that up easily. Secondly, the colonial assemblies represented a new way of relating to the mother country. The colonists were able to maintain a sense of autonomy and independence from the British government. They were able to do this because of the physical distance between the colonies and Britain, as well as the weak enforcement of British laws and regulations. And thirdly, the colonial assemblies represented a new way of thinking about politics. The colonists developed a strong sense of political identity. They were Americans, and they were willing to fight for their rights and their autonomy. So that's what we need to remember about colonial assemblies. They represented a new way of governing, a new way of relating to the mother country, and a new way of thinking about politics. Now if you want to keep learning about American colonial history, thanks. Subscribe, share, like, comment.